Lady Vivian Ravensmere had never envied the women who dazzled every ballroom they entered. Beauty faded, applause disappeared, and whispers always found a new victim. What she longed for was far simpler. She wanted someone to look at her without pity. She wanted to belong inside the family whose name she carried. Instead, she spent most evenings watching life happen from the edges of crowded rooms where forgotten daughters quietly learned how to disappear. Her mother had died when she was only 9 years old, leaving behind little more than a faded portrait, a small silver brooch shaped like a rose, and memories that grew softer with each passing year. After Lord Richard Ravensmere remarried, the manner changed. The laughter became louder, yet somehow less warm. Lady Cecilia Ravensmere, elegant and ambitious, filled every room with perfect manners and carefully chosen smiles. She adored her own daughter, Arabella, and made certain everyone else did too. Arabella received the finest tutors, the prettiest gowns from London, and every compliment that entered the house. Vivienne received responsibilities. She supervised the flower arrangements, read letters to elderly tenants whose eyesight had failed, comforted frightened kitchen maids on their first day, and spent hours helping old Mrs. Pennington in the laundry whenever the work became too heavy. No one had assigned those tasks to her. She simply noticed what needed to be done. Most people never noticed her. "You're too quiet," Lady Cecilia often remarked. "People admire confidence, not silence." Vivienne would lower her eyes and answer politely, "Yes, mother." She stopped correcting the title years ago. Her real mother had earned that word. Lady Cecilia had merely inherited it. Every morning before sunrise, Vivienne escaped to the manor gardens where the air smelled of damp earth and climbing roses. There she met the head gardener, Mr. Hawthorne, whose hands were rough from decades of honest work. He never treated her like an inconvenience. "You know why roses survive winter?" he asked. One chilly morning as frost covered the hedges, Vivienne shook her head. "Because their roots remember spring even when the world forgets." She smiled softly. "I wish people remembered each other the same way." The old gardener looked at her with kind eyes. "Some do, my lady. They simply haven't met you yet." His words settled quietly inside her heart, where hope still refused to die. News spread through Ravensmere Manor that the Crown's midwinter ball would be hosted there for the first time in nearly 40 years. Nobles from across the kingdom would attend. Musicians had arrived from the capital. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they reflected every candle. Fresh garlands draped the grand staircase. The kitchens worked day and night preparing pastries, roasted pheasant, sugared fruits, and delicate desserts that looked too beautiful to eat. Servants whispered exciting rumours as they hurried through the halls. "The king's cousin is coming." Several earls accepted the invitation. They say the Duke of Winterbourne has finally returned from abroad. That last rumour reached every corner of the manor. Frederick, Duke of Winterbourne, was respected throughout the kingdom, not because he sought attention, but because he rarely wasted words. Stories claimed he remembered the names of stable boys, wrote letters to soldiers' widows, and personally funded schools in villages no nobleman had ever visited. Vivienne listened without joining the conversations. Great men rarely noticed forgotten women. 3 days before the ball, dressmakers from London arrived carrying enormous wooden trunks. Lady Cecilia clapped her hands excitedly as bolts of shimmering silk spilled across the drawing room. Arabella twirled before the mirrors, wearing sapphire blue. The younger cousins admired pearl necklaces and embroidered gloves. Vivienne quietly folded discarded ribbons and gathered loose pins from the carpet before someone stepped on them. "Vivienne," Lady Cecilia called, without looking up. "Be sure Arabella's hem is pressed again. I noticed one wrinkle." "Of course." "And polish her dancing slippers?" "Yes." "Oh, and remind the servants your room is needed for the ladies' hair preparations." Vivienne nodded. "Where shall I dress?" Lady Cecilia finally looked at her. "You misunderstand. You won't be attending." The room became strangely quiet. Even Arabella stopped smiling for a moment. Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. Lady Cecilia continued calmly, "Too many distinguished guests will be present. We cannot risk unnecessary questions." Vivienne understood exactly what she meant. Since childhood, a pale scar along her neck had drawn curious stares whenever strangers met her. It came from the same carriage accident that claimed her mother's life. Though it never troubled Vivienne, Lady Cecilia considered it unsuitable for important gatherings. "You may observe from the upper gallery," Lady Cecilia added. "You'll still enjoy the music." No one objected, not even her father. His silence hurt more than her stepmother's words ever could. That evening, long after the household had gone to sleep, someone knocked gently on Vivienne's door. It was Mrs. Agnes Pennington, the oldest servant in the manor, carrying a carefully wrapped bundle. "I believe this belongs to you." Vivienne unfolded layers of linen until an ivory gown appeared beneath the candlelight. Delicate, hand-stitched roses decorated the sleeves. "My mother's," Mrs. Pennington smiled. "She wore it the night your father asked her to dance for the first time." Vivienne traced the embroidery with trembling fingers. "I thought it had been given away." "Some things are too precious to lose." Tears blurred her vision. "There's no reason to wear it." "Perhaps not tonight," Mrs. Pennington whispered, "but never believe a beautiful dress has only one evening waiting for it." After the old housekeeper left, Vivienne carefully hung the gown beside the window where moonlight bathed it in silver. For a long time, she simply looked at it, imagining another life where her mother still laughed downstairs and her father smiled whenever she entered a room. Outside, snow began falling across the gardens. The morning of the midwinter ball arrived wrapped in white. Carriages rolled through the gates from dawn until evening. Servants rushed across polished corridors carrying silver trays and towering flower arrangements. Musicians tuned violins beneath glittering chandeliers, while cooks shouted instructions from the kitchens. Vivienne spent the day helping everyone else prepare. She fastened Arabella's necklace, sewed a loose button onto her father's evening coat, delivered hot tea to exhausted footmen, comforted a frightened maid who had accidentally broken a crystal glass. By sunset, the manor glowed with thousands of candles. Laughter echoed through every corridor. Vivienne slipped quietly back into her room. She looked once more at her mother's ivory gown. Slowly, she lifted it from the hanger and held it against herself before the mirror. For just one heartbeat, she imagined walking down the grand staircase. She imagined hearing her name announced. She imagined someone smiling because she had arrived instead of wondering why she had. A sharp knock broke the silence. Lady Cecilia entered. Her eyes immediately found the gown. "Put it away." Vivienne lowered it gently. "I only wanted to remember her." "Remember her if you wish, but you will not wear that dress tonight." Her voice remained perfectly controlled. "The guests are already arriving." Vivienne nodded. "Yes." Lady Cecilia stepped toward the door before speaking again. "Watch from the balcony. It is the best place for someone who isn't meant to be noticed." When the door closed, Vivienne stood alone for several moments. Then She carefully returned the gown to its place, pinned her mother's silver rose brooch inside her plain cream dress where no one could see it, and climbed the narrow staircase leading to the old gallery above the ballroom. From there, she could see everything. Hundreds of candles shimmered against crystal chandeliers. Violins filled the air with graceful melodies. Noble ladies floated across polished marble beside gentlemen in immaculate evening coats. Laughter rose like music itself. Below, Lord Richard welcomed distinguished guests, while Arabella accepted compliments with practised elegance. No one glanced toward the shadowed balcony. Vivienne rested her hands on the carved railing and quietly admired the happiness she had been told was not meant for her. Then the great doors opened once more. Conversation softened. Even the orchestra seemed to hesitate. Frederick, Duke of Winterbourne, stepped into the ballroom. He acknowledged the welcoming smiles with a respectful nod, but instead of searching for the wealthiest host or the prettiest lady, his eyes wandered thoughtfully across the room, taking in the servants, the musicians, the guests, and finally the quiet figure, standing alone above them all. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. Yet something in his expression made Vivienne realize it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at her as though she deserved to be seen. Frederick did not immediately step farther into the ballroom. Instead, he remained near the entrance, his attention lingering for a brief moment on the young woman standing alone above the celebration. She did not wave, nor did she attempt to draw anyone's notice. There was no bitterness in her expression, only a quiet sadness that seemed strangely out of place amid the glittering chandeliers and elegant laughter. It was the kind of face a man remembered long after forgetting 100 beautiful smiles. "Your Grace," Lord Richard said warmly as he approached, "what an honour to welcome you to Ravensmere Manor." Frederick offered a courteous bow. "Thank you for your hospitality, Lord Ravensmere. Your home is magnificent." Lord Richard beamed with pride. "Please allow me to introduce my family." Arabella stepped forward gracefully, curtsying with practised elegance while Lady Cecilia watched with obvious satisfaction. Frederick exchanged the expected pleasantries, yet as the introductions ended, his gaze drifted upward once again. The balcony was now empty. "Was someone watching from the gallery?" he asked casually. Lord Richard hesitated so briefly that most people would have missed it. Lady Cecilia answered before he could. "Only one of the servants checking the candles, Your Grace." Frederick nodded politely, but something in her answer felt rehearsed. Throughout the evening he noticed small things that others overlooked. Every servant smiled warmly whenever a young lady in a simple cream dress quietly passed through the corridors carrying fresh flowers or assisting elderly guests who needed support climbing the stairs. One elderly countess accidentally dropped her embroidered handkerchief. Before any noblewoman reacted, the quiet young lady retrieved it, knelt gracefully, and returned it with a gentle smile. "Bless you, child," the Countess whispered. "You remind me of my own daughter." Vivienne simply inclined her head and disappeared before anyone could thank her further. Frederick watched the exchange from across the ballroom. "Who is she?" he quietly asked his long-time steward, Mr. Collins, who accompanied him on formal occasions. The older man followed his gaze. "I'm not certain, Your Grace, but judging by how the staff greet her, she is no ordinary servant." Frederick frowned thoughtfully. There was refinement in the way she moved, in the way she carried herself. Years of diplomatic service had taught him that true grace rarely depended upon expensive clothing. As the orchestra began another waltz, Lady Cecilia eagerly guided Arabella toward the Duke. "Your Grace," she said with polished charm, "my daughter has been looking forward to this evening for weeks." Arabella lowered her eyes modestly. "It would be an honour." Frederick smiled politely. "Lady Arabella, perhaps later in the evening. I promised my first dance to the widow of an old friend whose husband served beside my father." Lady Cecilia forced a gracious smile, though disappointment briefly crossed her face. "Of course." Frederick fulfilled his promise exactly as he had said. The elderly widow's eyes filled with tears when he invited her onto the dance floor. Around the ballroom, conversations softened as guests watched the Duke waltz with a woman long past the age most gentlemen would have noticed. Vivian watched from the gallery, surprised. She had expected grandeur. Instead, she saw kindness. After the music ended, Frederick escorted the widow back to her seat, before quietly excusing himself from the growing circle of admirers eager for conversation. Rather than joining the card tables or accepting introductions from ambitious families, he wandered toward the terrace overlooking the snow-covered gardens. He welcomed moments of silence during crowded evenings. As he stepped outside, he heard the faint sound of someone humming. Following the melody, he found Vivian kneeling beside a stone planter, carefully covering delicate white roses with linen cloth to protect them from the freezing wind. "Most people are enjoying the ball," he remarked gently. Vivian looked up in surprise, quickly rising to curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace. Didn't realize anyone had come outside." "There's nothing to forgive." His eyes rested on the flowers. "You're protecting them." She smiled softly. "They survived all autumn. It would be a shame to lose them before spring." Frederick studied the fragile blooms beneath their coverings. "You care for them as though they're family." Vivian looked toward the dark garden. "Sometimes flowers only need someone to believe they'll bloom again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snowflakes drifted silently between them. "I believe we met without being introduced," Frederick finally said. Vivian hesitated. "I'm Lady Vivian Ravensmere." The Duke's expression remained perfectly calm, though surprise flickered behind his eyes. "Lord Ravensmere introduced Lady Arabella as his daughter," Vivian answered honestly. "She is his daughter." Frederick looked at her curiously. "And you?" A faint smile touched her lips, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "I suppose that depends on whom you ask." Before he could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed across the terrace. Lady Cecilia appeared, her smile strained. "Vivienne, there you are. Mrs. Pennington has been looking everywhere for you. Several guests require assistance in the dining hall." Vivienne bowed politely. "Excuse me, Your Grace." She disappeared through the doors without another word. Lady Cecilia forced another pleasant smile toward the Duke. "She's always happiest when helping the servants, such a generous nature." Frederick nodded politely, though her explanation answered nothing. As the evening continued, his curiosity only deepened. He noticed that every servant addressed Vivienne with genuine affection, while every member of her family treated her as though she occupied the space between guest and employee. Later, during supper, Frederick observed something even stranger. The long family table contained places for Lord Richard, Lady Cecilia, Arabella, several cousins and honoured guests. Vivienne's chair stood empty. A young footman quietly carried a tray upstairs instead. Frederick watched him disappear toward the gallery staircase. "Who is receiving supper?" he asked another servant. The young man looked uncomfortable. "Lady Vivian, Your Grace." "Why isn't she dining with her family?" The footman lowered his voice. "I couldn't possibly say, sir." Frederick thanked him, but found little appetite for the elaborate feast before him. Across the room, laughter filled the hall as guests praised the evening's elegance. Yet all he could think about was the quiet young woman eating alone somewhere above the music. Upstairs, Vivienne sat beside the balcony window with a simple meal resting untouched before her. Below, another lively waltz echoed through the ballroom. She could hear applause after each dance, followed by cheerful conversations she would never join. Mrs. Pennington quietly entered, carrying a cup of warm tea. "You should eat something, my dear." Vivienne smiled. "I'm not very hungry." The elderly housekeeper sat beside her. "When your mother attended her first ball in this very room, she told me something I'll never forget." Vivienne turned toward her. "What was it?" "The brightest candle is rarely the loudest one." Mrs. Pennington gently squeezed her hand. She believed goodness always finds its way into the light eventually. Vivienne glanced toward the ballroom below. I'm beginning to wonder if she was simply too hopeful. Before Mrs. Pennington could answer, the orchestra suddenly stopped. Curious voices drifted upward as guests turned toward the grand staircase. Vivienne stepped cautiously onto the balcony. From above, she saw Frederick standing near the foot of the stairs, speaking quietly with Lord Richard. Though she could not hear every word, one sentence reached her clearly through the sudden hush. "Before this evening ends," the Duke said calmly, "there is one member of your family I would very much like to meet properly." Lord Richard's smile faltered, and for the first time that night, Lady Cecilia looked genuinely afraid. Lord Richard forced a nervous smile as the ballroom waited for his reply. "Your Grace, I'm certain introductions can wait until another occasion." Frederick remained courteous, but there was quiet resolve in his voice. "I have learned that delaying simple kindness often becomes lifelong regret. If Lady Vivienne is present this evening, I would consider it a privilege to meet her properly." A murmur spread among the guests. Lady Cecilia's fingers tightened around her fan. "I'm afraid she is indisposed." Before anyone could speak again, Mrs. Pennington stepped quietly into the ballroom, carrying an empty tray. Frederick recognized her immediately. "Madam," he said gently, "would you be so kind as to tell Lady Vivienne that Frederick, Duke of Winterbourne, would be honoured if she would join us?" The elderly housekeeper glanced briefly toward Lord Richard, whose expression betrayed uncertainty. Then she looked at Vivienne's father with the quiet courage only years of truth could bring. "Yes, Your Grace." She climbed the staircase without another word. Above the ballroom, Vivienne stood frozen. "Mrs. Pennington, I cannot go down there." The old housekeeper smiled warmly. "Your mother once told me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing truth while your hands are still trembling." Vivienne looked toward the ivory gown hanging in her room. "I have nothing suitable to wear." Mrs. Pennington opened the wardrobe and carefully lifted the gown into her hands. "Tonight, you wear this." Within minutes, Vivienne stood before the small mirror, her mother's gown fitting as though it had been waiting for her all these years. The lace framed her shoulders gracefully, and the silver rose brooch rested over her heart. She did not hide the scar on her neck. For the first time in years, she made no attempt to cover it. Mrs. Pennington's eyes glistened with tears. "Your mother would have been so proud." Vivienne drew one steady breath. "Whatever happens next, thank you for never forgetting me." Downstairs, conversations filled the silence while guests pretended not to stare toward the staircase. Lady Cecilia whispered urgently to Lord Richard, "Stop this before people begin asking questions." But before he could respond, footsteps echoed above. Every head turned. Vivienne descended the grand staircase alone. The ballroom became so still that only the distant crackling of the fireplaces could be heard. Some guests recognized her immediately. Others looked puzzled, whispering quietly among themselves. Frederick stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He bowed respectfully. "Lady Vivian Ravensmere, thank you for granting me the introduction I should have received when I arrived." Vivian curtsied. "The honour is mine, Your Grace." Frederick noticed the faint scar Lady Cecilia had worked so hard to hide. It neither startled nor discouraged him. If anything, it explained the sadness he had seen in her eyes. "Would you allow me one question?" he asked. She nodded. "Why were you watching the ball from the balcony instead of dancing below?" The room seemed to stop breathing. Vivienne could have lied. She could have protected the family's reputation one final time. Instead, she answered with calm honesty. "Because I was told the celebration would be more beautiful if no one noticed I was here." Several ladies lowered their eyes. An elderly gentleman quietly shook his head. Frederick looked toward Lord Richard. "Is that true?" Lord Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Lady Cecilia stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace, you misunderstand. We only wish to spare her unnecessary attention." Vivian interrupted softly. "Please." Everyone turned toward her. "I have spent enough years explaining away my own loneliness." Her voice never rose. "No one forced me to hate my family. I chose not to. But neither can I pretend that kindness was shown where it was not." The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Frederick admired the remarkable grace with which she spoke. There was no anger, no desire to embarrass anyone, only truth. He extended his hand. "Lady Vivian, the orchestra has been waiting long enough. May I have this waltz?" Shock rippled through the ballroom. Arabella stared in disbelief. Lady Cecilia's fan slipped from her hand onto the polished floor. Vivienne looked at the offered hand for only a moment before placing her own gently in it. As they stepped onto the dance floor, the orchestra resumed its music. The first notes of the waltz floated beneath the chandeliers like candlelight carried on a gentle breeze. Frederick guided her with quiet confidence. "You dance beautifully," he said. She smiled shyly. "My mother taught me before she passed away. Then she taught you very well." They moved effortlessly across the ballroom. Guests who had spent the evening chasing attention now watched the woman they had scarcely noticed only minutes before. Vivian no longer felt invisible. She felt free. "May I tell you something?" Frederick asked. "Of course. When I entered this house tonight, I saw many elegant people." He smiled gently. "But I only saw one truly gracious heart." Vivian lowered her eyes, overcome by emotion. "You hardly know me." Sometimes character introduces itself before names ever do. As the final notes of the waltz faded, applause erupted throughout the ballroom. It began with the servants, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, and house staff quietly clapped first. Then the guests joined them until the entire room echoed with heartfelt applause. Vivienne looked around in astonishment, not because they admired her dress, not because she had danced with a duke, but because, perhaps for the first time, they truly saw her. Frederick turned toward Lord Richard. "My lord, may I offer a piece of advice?" The older man nodded silently. "A father's greatest inheritance is not land or titles. It is the confidence he places in his children. Guard it carefully, because once lost, it is painfully difficult to restore." Lord Richard's eyes filled with regret. He slowly approached Vivian. For several moments he simply looked at the daughter he had allowed himself to overlook. "Vivian," his voice broke, "I believed protecting our family's reputation mattered more than protecting your heart." Tears gathered in his eyes. "I was wrong." Vivian searched his face. She saw shame, sorrow, and a man finally recognizing the cost of his silence. "I cannot recover the years we lost," he continued quietly, "but if you can find it within yourself to forgive me, I would spend whatever years remain trying to become the father you deserved." Vivian stepped forward and embraced him. The ballroom remained silent, many guests discreetly wiping tears from their eyes. Even Lady Cecilia lowered her gaze, unable to defend what everyone had witnessed. Weeks passed after the midwinter ball, yet the story spread throughout the kingdom. Strangely, people spoke less about the Duke's dance than about the forgotten daughter, whose quiet dignity had humbled an entire ballroom. Invitations began arriving at Ravensmere Manor, addressed not only to Arabella but also to Lady Vivian. Children from the nearby village continued running to greet her whenever she visited. Elderly tenants smiled when she stopped to read their letters. Nothing about her kindness had changed. Only the world had finally noticed it. On the first morning of spring, Frederick returned to Ravensmere Manor carrying a small wooden box. Inside lay a single ivory dance card from the midwinter ball. Only one line had been written upon it. The first dance was memorable. "May I have every dance that follows?" Vivian looked up, smiling through happy tears. "Is that your way of proposing?" Frederick laughed softly. "I considered making a long speech." "What changed your mind?" "I remembered something you taught me." She tilted her head curiously. "And what was that?" He gently took her hand. "That truth never needs complicated words." Beneath the blooming roses, where winter had finally surrendered to spring, she whispered the answer he had hoped for. Yes. And long after the music of that unforgettable ball had faded, people still remembered the night a forgotten daughter stepped down from a lonely balcony and discovered that the right person had been looking up all along. Some hearts are overlooked not because they lack worth, but because the world has forgotten